Imagine standing in the silence of dawn, where ancient stones catch the first light of morning. The wind carries whispers of voices that spoke languages we can barely remember, of hands that shaped clay into vessels, of minds that gazed at the same stars we see tonight. This is where our story begins, in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we wonder. Long before the borders we draw on maps today, before the history books were written, there lived people whose thoughts moved like rivers through time. They were not so different from us. They loved, they dreamed, they asked the same questions we ask when we look up at the night sky. What lies beyond the horizon? How do we build something that will last? What happens when we close our eyes for the final time? These ancient minds did not simply survive in their world, they sculpted it. They raised cities from nothing, carved laws into stone, and built monuments that still stand today, patient and mysterious. They mapped the movements of planets with precision that amazes us even now. They sailed across vast oceans without compass or map, guided only by the rhythm of waves and the dance of stars. In the ruins of Catalhoyuk, archaeologists found a city unlike any other. No streets divided the buildings. Instead, people walked across rooftops, climbing down ladders into their homes below. It was a place where community meant something different, where the boundary between private and shared dissolved into something we struggle to understand today. In the Indus Valley, engineers designed drainage systems that would be admired in any modern city. They standardized bricks across distances that would take months to travel, creating a unity of purpose that spanned continents. They understood water, earth, and fire in ways that seem almost magical to us now. These were not primitive people stumbling towards civilization. They were complex societies with rich inner lives, deep spiritual beliefs, and technologies that challenge our assumptions about the past. They healed with plants we are only beginning to understand again. They calculated eclipses centuries before they occurred. They created art that still moves us to wonder. Tonight, as you listen to these stories, you are hearing the echoes of minds that thought thoughts remarkably similar to your own. They wondered about their place in the cosmos. They sought meaning in the patterns of nature. They built beautiful things not just for survival, but for joy, for mystery, for the simple pleasure of creation. This is not the story of how civilization began. This is the story of how it has always been with us, flowing like an underground river through time, surfacing in moments of brilliance that illuminate the endless creativity of human consciousness. The first civilizations were not the dawn of human achievement. They were human achievement, complete and whole, as bright and complex as anything we have built since. Let yourself drift into their world, where the line between the possible and the impossible was drawn in different places, where the sacred and the practical danced together, where the greatest mysteries were not problems to be solved but wonders to be lived. Picture a city where no one walks on streets, where children learn to climb before they learn to walk on level ground, where neighbors visit each other by stepping across rooftops, where the sound of footsteps comes from above rather than below. This was Catalhoyuk, a place that challenges everything we think we know about how cities should be built. 9,000 years ago, in what we now call Turkey, thousands of people lived in houses that shared walls like honeycomb cells. There were no doors facing outward, no streets cutting between buildings. Instead, people entered their homes through holes in the roof, climbing down wooden ladders into rooms where families gathered around hearths, where children played with clay figurines, where elders told stories that drifted up through the smoke holes into the star-filled night. The rooftops became their highways. Imagine walking home from a day of work, stepping from roof to roof, greeting neighbors who might be drying grain or mending tools in the open air above their dwellings. The city breathed differently this way. Privacy and community existed in layers, like the settled dust of centuries. But Catalhoyuk was not alone in reimagining what a city could be. Far to the east in the Indus Valley, engineers were designing something equally remarkable but utterly different. At Dolavira, they carved reservoirs into rock that could hold millions of gallons of water. These were not simple holes in the ground, but sophisticated systems with channels and dams, with steps leading down to the water's edge like stone prayers for rain. The people of Dolavira understood water in ways that seem almost mystical to us now. They knew how to catch monsoon rains and hold them through the dry months. They built their city around water, not despite it. Every street, every building, every wall was positioned to work with the flow of precious liquid through their world. When archaeologists map these cities today, they find drainage systems that would impress modern engineers, toilets in private homes connected to covered sewers, public baths that speak of a culture that valued cleanliness as much as they valued beauty. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk was growing into something the world had never seen before. By 3000 BC, perhaps 50,000 people lived within its walls. 50,000 human souls, each with their own dreams and fears and daily routines, all finding ways to live together in a space that would have seemed impossibly crowded to their ancestors who roamed in small bands across the landscape. Uruk was not just large, it was organized. Clay tablets found in its ruins tell us of property disputes, of zoning laws, of regulations about where craftsmen could work and where merchants could sell their goods. These tablets, pressed with wedge-shaped marks that we call cuneiform, record the voices of people arguing about the same things we argue about today. Whose wall is whose? Who is responsible when a building collapses? How do we fairly distribute water during drought? The scribes of Uruk wrote down the first urban planning codes, rules that divided the city into districts for different purposes. There were areas for temples, areas for workshops, areas for homes. They created the world's first building codes, specifying how thick walls should be, how deep foundations should go, what materials could be used for different kinds of construction. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these early cities was not their size or their sophistication. It was the transformation they represented in the human mind. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived in small groups, following herds, following seasons, following the endless rhythms of migration that connected them directly to the natural world. City life required a different kind of thinking. It required people to imagine themselves as part of something larger than their immediate family or clan. It required them to create rules that would work for strangers as well as relatives. It required them to think about the future in new ways, to plan not just for the next hunt or the next harvest, but for the next generation, the next century, the next 1,000 years. In these first cities, human consciousness was learning to hold multiple layers of belonging at once. You were a member of your household, your neighborhood, your profession, your city, all simultaneously. You had to navigate relationships with people you had never met, follow rules created by people you would never know, contribute to projects that would outlast your own lifetime. The shift from tribal to urban life was not just a change in where people lived, it was a change in how they thought about time, about space, about their obligations to each other and to the future. The first cities were not just collections of buildings. They were new forms of human consciousness, new ways of dreaming collectively about what life could become. These ancient urban planners understood something we are still learning today. A city is not just a place where people happen to live close together. It is a living system, a web of relationships between humans and their environment, a conversation between the present and the future carried on in stone and clay and flowing water. The daily rhythms of these ancient cities pulse with life even in the archaeological record. In Catalhoyuk, archaeologists have found rooms where families lived for generations, where the floors were replastered dozens of times, where the bones of ancestors were buried beneath the sleeping platforms of their descendants. The walls were painted with images of vultures, of bulls, of geometric patterns that may have held meanings we can only guess at. These were not just places to sleep and eat. They were sacred spaces where the living and the dead shared the same roof, where every room held layers of memory pressed into clay. The people of Catalhoyuk made their tools from obsidian that came from volcanoes hundreds of miles away. They wove textiles so fine that traces still cling to the metal pins found in their graves. They created mirrors from polished stone that reflected faces we will never see, but whose expressions of wonder and worry and joy were probably much like our own. When a house grew old or when a family wanted to start fresh, They would fill it with clean earth and build a new home directly on top. The city grew upward this way, layer by layer, century by century, like a slow-motion tree adding rings of human habitation. In the Indus Valley cities, the attention to water reached almost artistic levels. At Harappa, they built covered drains large enough for a person to walk through, lined with precisely fitted bricks. Every major street had its own drainage channel. Every neighborhood had public wells built to a standard depth and width. The water systems were so well designed that they continued working for over 1,000 years, long after the civilization that built them had faded into legend. But these Indus Valley cities held deeper mysteries too. Their script has never been deciphered. Thousands of seals have been found, carved with symbols that might be writing, might be art, might be something else entirely. Some show figures in meditation poses, others depict animals both real and mythical. There are unicorns with flowing manes, humped bulls with jewelry hanging from their necks, tigers that seem to dance rather than hunt. The seals were used to mark property, to seal containers, to identify their owners across the vast trade networks that connected these cities to places as distant as Mesopotamia and Central Asia. The mystery deepens when you realize that across this entire civilization, spanning an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, there is almost no evidence of warfare. No weapons caches, no fortified walls, no images of conquest or battle. Either these people lived in remarkable peace, or they expressed conflict in ways we do not yet understand. Their cities were planned with an egalitarian spirit that seems almost revolutionary even today. Houses varied in size, but not dramatically. There were no palaces, no obvious temples, no monuments to individual rulers. If there were kings and queens in the Indus Valley, they left no trace of their power in stone. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the opposite was true. Cities like Uruk and Babylon celebrated hierarchy, power, and individual achievement. The ziggurats rose like artificial mountains toward the sky, their stepped sides climbing toward temples where priests communicated with gods on behalf of entire populations. These were not just religious buildings but administrative centers, grain storage facilities, astronomical observatories, and symbols of civic pride all rolled into monumental packages that could be seen from miles away. The city of Babylon in particular became legendary for its size and sophistication. Greek historians wrote with awe about its hanging gardens, its wide processional streets, its gates decorated with dragons and bulls made from brilliant blue glazed brick. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed now in a museum in Berlin, gives us just a hint of how magnificent these cities must have been when they were alive with activity, when merchants from India and craftsmen from Egypt walked through streets where a dozen languages mixed in the air like incense. But even in these hierarchical cities, there was innovation that served ordinary people. The first shopping districts appeared here, with standardized weights and measures, with regulations protecting customers from dishonest merchants. The first banks emerged, lending silver and barley to farmers and traders. The first schools taught not just the children of the wealthy, but anyone who showed aptitude for learning the complex art of writing. These early urban systems created something unprecedented in human history, networks of specialized knowledge that could accumulate across generations. A potter in Uruk could learn techniques from masters who had learned from their masters, stretching back through centuries of accumulated skill. A scribe could copy texts that preserved mathematical insights, astronomical observations, and legal precedents. A physician could study symptoms and treatments recorded by healers who had died long before his birth. The cities became libraries of human knowledge, not written in books but embedded in the daily practices of craftsmen, the seasonal routines of farmers, the careful observations of priests who tracked the movements of stars and planets. Each generation could build on the insights of those who came before, creating a spiral of innovation that lifted human capability higher and higher. As you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine walking through these ancient streets, or across these rooftops, or along these carefully planned waterways. Feel the presence of thousands of people who lived and worked and dreamed in these places, who solved problems we are still working on, who created beauty that still moves us across the centuries. Picture the children playing in courtyards that echo with laughter across 5,000 years, the merchants negotiating deals that connected distant lands, the engineers calculating water flow with mathematics we still use today. They were not so different from us. They were us at a different moment in the long conversation between human consciousness and the world it seeks to understand and shape. In the quiet halls of ancient courts, where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight filtering through stone windows, human beings first began to imagine what justice might look like. Not the simple justice of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but something more subtle, more thoughtful, more aware of the complexity that emerges when thousands of people try to live together in harmony. Picture a courtroom in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago. A physician stands before a judge accused of causing harm during surgery. The punishment, if he is found guilty, is severe. His hands might be cut off, ending his career forever, but the law that governs this moment, carved into a towering pillar of black stone, also protects him. If he can prove he followed proper procedures, if he can show that the patient's death was not due to negligence but to the will of the gods or the natural course of illness, he will walk free. This was the world created by Hammurabi's Code, one of the first attempts to write down the rules that should govern human behavior. The code covered everything from medical malpractice to construction defects, from marriage contracts to the proper wages for different kinds of work. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would face death. If a surgeon successfully operated on a wealthy patient, he would receive 10 silver pieces. If the same surgeon healed a slave, he would receive only 2. These laws seem harsh to us now, but they represented something revolutionary. For the first time in human history, justice was not simply the whim of whoever held power at the moment. It was a system, written down, public, predictable. A farmer could know in advance what would happen if his ox gored his neighbor's sheep. A merchant could plan her business knowing exactly what taxes she would owe and what penalties she would face for dishonest dealing. But even more remarkable than Babylon's laws were the rights enjoyed by women in ancient Egypt. While women in many other civilizations were considered property of their fathers and husbands, Egyptian women could own land, run businesses, and initiate divorce proceedings. They could testify in court, serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, and inherit property from their parents. Some became pharaohs, ruling over one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth with absolute authority. Egyptian divorce records, written on papyrus that has survived in the dry desert air for thousands of years, tell stories that sound surprisingly modern. A woman named Senui divorced her husband because he failed to support their children adequately. Another, named Hainet, left her husband and took half their property with her, as the law allowed. These were not exceptional cases, but routine legal proceedings, handled by courts that recognized women as full participants in society rather than silent dependents. The legal documents reveal a civilization where marriage was seen as a partnership between equals, where both husband and wife contributed to the household's wealth and both had rights to its protection. Egyptian women worked as scribes, doctors, priestesses, and business owners. They signed contracts, paid taxes, and made wills disposing of their property as they saw fit. In a world where most women had few legal protections, Egyptian women enjoyed freedoms that would not become common in other cultures for thousands of years. But perhaps no ancient society took the education of its citizens more seriously than Sparta. The agog, the brutal training system that shaped Spartan boys into warriors, began when children were only 7 years old. Boys were taken from their families and placed in communal barracks where they learned to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint. They slept on beds made of reeds they gathered themselves. They were given only 1 cloak per year, wearing it in summer heat and winter cold alike. The Spartan system was designed to create warriors who would never retreat, never surrender, never show fear in the face of death, but it was also designed to create citizens who understood that individual desires must sometimes be sacrificed for the good of the community. Spartan boys learned to share everything, to support their comrades, to value honor above comfort and duty above personal gain. The harsh training created soldiers who were nearly invincible in battle, but it also created a society where every citizen understood their obligations to their neighbors and their state. Meanwhile, in Athens, a different kind of revolutionary system was taking shape. Democracy, the the radical idea that ordinary citizens could participate directly in governing themselves. But Athenian democracy came with its own unique safeguards, including one of the strangest political institutions ever devised: ostracism. Once a year, if enough citizens demanded it, the assembly would hold a special vote. Every citizen would write a name on a piece of broken pottery called an ostracon. The person whose name appeared most often would be banished from the city for 10 years. Ostracism was not a punishment for any crime. It was a preventive measure, a way of removing someone who had become too powerful, too popular, or too dangerous to the stability of democratic government. The exiled person kept all their property and retained their citizenship. After 10 years, they could return and resume their normal life. It was democracy's way of protecting itself from the ambitions of individuals who might otherwise become tyrants. The system worked because it was based on a profound understanding of human nature. The Athenians knew that even in a democracy, certain individuals would inevitably accumulate more influence than others. Rather than waiting for such people to abuse their power, ostracism allowed the community to intervene before any damage was done. It was justice as prevention rather than punishment, wisdom rather than vengeance. Even more sophisticated was the system developed by the Lycian League, a confederation of cities in what is now southern Turkey. The Lycians created the world's first known system of proportional representation, where different cities had different numbers of votes based on their size and importance. Large cities like Xanthos had 3 votes in the League Assembly, medium cities had 2 votes, and small cities had 1 vote each. This ensured that no single city could dominate the others, while also preventing tiny communities from having disproportionate influence over League decisions. The Lycian system balanced the competing demands of equality and practicality in ways that modern democracies still struggle with. How do you give everyone a voice while also acknowledging that some voices represent more people than others? How do you prevent the majority from oppressing the minority while also ensuring that the majority's will can be expressed? The Lycians solved these problems through careful attention to the mathematics of representation, creating a system stable enough to last for centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these ancient legal systems was how they dealt with the everyday problems that arise when people live together. In Mesopotamian cities, detailed records survive of neighborhood disputes that sound remarkably familiar. A homeowner in Babylon complained that his neighbor's wall was cracking and might collapse onto his property. A merchant in Ur sued another trader for selling him grain that was contaminated with sand. A woman in Nippur brought charges against a physician who she claimed had made her illness worse rather than better. These cases were heard by judges who had to balance competing claims, weigh evidence, and try to reach decisions that would satisfy both parties and serve the broader community. The legal documents revealed judges struggling with questions that still challenge courts today. How do you determine the truth when witnesses disagree? What compensation is fair when someone has been harmed but the harm was not intentional? How do you punish wrongdoing in ways that deter future crimes without being unnecessarily cruel? The Mesopotamian judges developed sophisticated procedures for handling these challenges. They required witnesses to swear oaths before testifying, calling on gods to punish them if they lied. They used expert testimony from craftsmen and physicians when technical knowledge was needed. They established rules about what kinds of evidence could be presented and how it should be evaluated. In complex cases, they sometimes required the parties to undergo ordeals, tests that were believed to reveal divine judgment about who was telling the truth. Meanwhile, in ancient Israel, a different approach to justice was emerging. The Hebrew legal tradition emphasized restoration rather than punishment, healing rather than retribution. When someone was wronged, the goal was not simply to make the wrongdoer suffer, but to repair the damage that had been done and restore harmony to the community. If a man stole his neighbor's ox, he was required not just to return the ox, but to compensate his neighbor for the loss of its labor during the time it was missing. The Hebrew courts also developed the principle that punishment should be proportional to the crime. The famous phrase "eye for eye, tooth for tooth" was not a call for brutality, but a limitation on revenge. It meant that punishment should not exceed the harm that was done. If someone injured your eye, you could not kill them in response. If someone stole your grain, you could not take their entire harvest. Justice required proportion restraint, and careful consideration of what would truly serve the cause of peace. In Celtic societies, justice took yet another form. Celtic law was based on honor and status rather than written codes. When someone was wronged, they could demand compensation based on their social position and the nature of the harm. A poet who was insulted could claim more compensation than a farmer who was insulted because poets held higher status in Celtic society. But this system also protected those of lower status by establishing minimum compensations that even the poorest person could claim when they were wronged. Celtic legal procedures were public ceremonies as much as judicial proceedings. Cases were heard at seasonal gatherings where entire communities would assemble to witness the proceedings. The judges, called brehons, were skilled in memorizing vast collections of legal precedents that had been passed down orally for generations. They could recite the appropriate punishment for hundreds of different offenses, the proper compensation for various types of harm, and the correct procedures for everything from marriage contracts to cattle raids. The public nature of Celtic justice served multiple purposes. It ensured that legal decisions were made transparently, where everyone could see that proper procedures were followed. It educated the community about their rights and obligations under the law, and it reinforced social bonds by bringing people together to participate in the process of maintaining order and resolving conflicts. In ancient Rome, legal innovation reached perhaps its highest expression in the development of the 12 Tables, the first written Roman law code. These laws were carved on bronze tablets and displayed in the Roman Forum where every citizen could read them. The creation of the 12 Tables came about through political struggle between the patricians, Rome's hereditary aristocracy, and the plebeians, the common people who made up the majority of Roman citizens. For generations, Roman law had been the secret knowledge of patrician judges who could interpret legal customs however they chose. Plebeians never knew in advance what punishment they might face for their actions or what rights they could claim in disputes. The demand for written laws was really a demand for legal equality for a system where the same rules would apply to rich and poor alike. The 12 Tables established principles that would influence legal systems for thousands of years. They protected private property while also recognizing community interests. They established procedures for fair trials while also providing swift punishment for serious crimes. They recognized the rights of fathers over their families while also protecting children from abuse. Most importantly, they established the principle that law should be public, predictable, and equally applied to all citizens regardless of their social status. These ancient legal and political systems emerged from the same fundamental human need, the desire to live together peacefully and fairly, to create communities where individuals could flourish while still contributing to the common good. Whether through Hammurabi's detailed codes, Egypt's protection of women's rights, Sparta's communal education, Athens's democratic participation, or Lycia's proportional representation, ancient peoples were experimenting with different ways of organizing human societies. Their solutions were not perfect. Many excluded slaves, foreigners, or women from full participation. Many relied on punishment that seems cruel by today's standards, but they represent humanity's first serious attempts to move beyond the simple rule of might makes right, to create systems based on principle rather than power, on law rather than whim. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine the voices of ancient legislators and judges, citizens and advocates, all working together to create the frameworks within which human communities could grow and thrive. Their debates echo still in every courtroom, every election, every moment when we choose cooperation over conflict, justice over revenge, the common good over individual gain. They were laying the foundations for every democracy, every constitution, every declaration of rights that would follow. In their careful words carved into stone and pressed into clay, they were writing the first chapters of humanity's long experiment in governing itself with wisdom rather than force. In the deep caves beneath the temple at Delphi, sweet gases seep from cracks in the ancient rock. Ethylene, we call it now, a natural compound that can induce visions, loosen the boundaries between the conscious and unconscious mind, open doorways to experiences that feel more real than ordinary reality. But to the ancient Greeks who came here seeking guidance, the vapors were the breath of Apollo himself, the god of prophecy speaking through his chosen priestess. Picture the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, seated on her three-legged stool above the sacred chasm. She has fasted for days, purified herself with spring water, chewed bay leaves until her mind began to drift. Now, as the sweet vapors rise around her, she enters a state that is neither fully conscious nor fully dreaming. Questions are whispered to her by priests who have traveled here from across the Mediterranean world. Kings and farmers, merchants and soldiers, all seeking to know what the future holds, what the gods desire, how they should navigate the uncertain waters of human existence. Her answers come in fragments, in strange poetry, in words that must be interpreted by the priests who attend her. But for over 1,000 years, people believed that in this altered state of consciousness, she could see beyond the veil of time, could access knowledge that was hidden from ordinary human awareness. Modern pilgrims still come to Delphi, though the oracle fell silent long ago. They stand in the ruins of the temple and try to imagine what it must have been like to believe so completely in the possibility of divine communication. Far to the east, in ancient China, a different kind of divination was taking place. Oracle bones, the shoulder blades of cattle, and the shells of turtles were carved with questions and then heated until they cracked. The patterns of these cracks were read as answers from the ancestors, the departed spirits who continued to watch over their descendants and guide their decisions. These were not casual consultations, but matters of state importance. Should the king plant crops this season? Was it auspicious to begin a military campaign? Would the rains come in time for the harvest? The questions carved into these bones reveal a civilization deeply connected to the spiritual world, where the dead were not gone but merely transformed, where their wisdom continued to flow into the world of the living through ritual practice. Chinese diviners developed elaborate systems for interpreting the bone cracks, creating what may have been the world's first written language. The characters they carved to record their questions and answers evolved over thousands of years into the script still used in China today. But perhaps no ancient practice challenges our modern sensibilities more than the sky burials of the Zoroastrians. In the high towers of silence built on hilltops throughout Persia, the dead were laid out naked under the open sky. Vultures would come to strip the flesh from their bones, returning the body to the cycle of nature in the most direct way possible. To Zoroastrian minds, this was not horrific but sacred. The earth was too pure to be contaminated by decay. Fire was too sacred to be used for burning bodies. Only the sky and the creatures that lived in it could properly receive the gift of human flesh. The ritual reflected a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of life and death. Nothing was wasted, nothing was lost. The body that had carried consciousness through its earthly journey became food for other living beings who would carry that substance forward into new forms of life. The bones, cleaned by wind and weather, were eventually collected and placed in ossuaries where they could rest in peace. It was a practice that required deep faith in the fundamental goodness of the natural world, in the idea that death was not an ending but a transformation, a return to the source from which all life springs. In Celtic lands, the relationship between kings and the sacred took a different form entirely. Kingship was understood not as political power but as spiritual marriage between the ruler and the land itself. The king was literally wed to the goddess who embodied the territory he ruled. His health and virtue directly affected the fertility of the soil, the abundance of the harvest, the prosperity of his people. If he became ill or corrupt, the land would sicken too. If he ruled with wisdom and justice, the earth would bloom in response. This sacred marriage was renewed through elaborate ceremonies that took place at seasonal turning points throughout the year. The king would drink from sacred wells, walk barefoot across fields that had been blessed by druids, participate in rituals that symbolically joined his life force with the spirit of the land. It was a form of governance that made the ruler accountable not just to his human subjects but to the forests and rivers, the mountains and meadows, all the non-human beings that shared his territory. Celtic druids served as intermediaries in this relationship between human and natural worlds. They were priests, judges, healers, and teachers all at once. Their training lasted 20 years and involved memorizing vast collections of poetry, lore, history, and spiritual wisdom. They could read omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of clouds, the behavior of animals. They understood the properties of plants not just as medicine but as allies in the work of maintaining harmony between human communities and the larger web of life. Meanwhile, in Etruria, the mysterious civilization that preceded Rome in central Italy, Priests called haruspices developed their own system for reading divine will. They examined the livers of sacrificed sheep, interpreting the colors, textures, and markings they found there as messages from the gods. Each section of the liver corresponded to a different aspect of divine concern. The priests had bronze models of livers marked with various zones and their meanings, training manuals that allowed them to decode the messages they found in fresh organs. To modern minds, this practice seems bizarre, even repulsive. But to the Etruscans, the liver was the seat of life force, the organ where divine energy was most concentrated in living beings. By studying its condition at the moment of death, they believed they could understand the spiritual currents that were flowing through the world at that particular time. It was a form of divination that required intimate knowledge of anatomy, careful observation, and the ability to interpret subtle variations in color and texture as meaningful communications. Etruscan haruspices were consulted before every major decision. Should the city go to war? Was it safe to begin construction of a new temple? Would a proposed marriage bring good fortune to both families? The priests would sacrifice a sheep, examine its liver with scientific precision, and provide answers based on their reading of its sacred signs. Roman generals later adopted this practice, rarely beginning a military campaign without first consulting haruspices about the likely outcome. But perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the sacred developed in the mystery schools of ancient Greece and Egypt. At Eleusis, near Athens, initiates underwent elaborate ceremonies that were said to reveal the deepest secrets of life and death. The exact nature of these mysteries was never written down and remains unknown to this day. What we do know is that participants often described the experience as transformative, as providing them with direct knowledge of their own immortal nature and their connection to the cosmic order. The Eleusinian mysteries likely involved the consumption of a psychoactive drink called kykeon, made from ergot-infected barley that contained compounds similar to those found in modern psychedelic substances. Under the influence of this sacred brew, participants experienced visions that convinced them of the continuity of consciousness beyond physical death. They saw themselves as part of an eternal cycle of death and rebirth, connected to the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, who represented the seasonal rhythms of growth, decay, and renewal that govern all life. Similar mystery traditions flourished throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. In Egypt, the temples of Isis offered initiations that promised participants direct experience of the divine feminine principle that underlies all creation. In Syria and Asia Minor, the mysteries of Mithras provided soldiers and merchants with a spiritual path that emphasized courage, loyalty, and the ultimate triumph of light over darkness. These were not intellectual teachings, but experiential practices, rituals designed to produce altered states of consciousness in which participants could encounter the sacred directly. These ancient spiritual practices emerged from a worldview radically different from our own. They assumed that consciousness was not limited to the human brain but was a fundamental property of the universe itself. They believed that with proper preparation and practice, human awareness could expand beyond its ordinary boundaries, could commune with gods and ancestors, could perceive patterns and connections that are invisible to normal perception. Whether through oracle vapors or ancestral bones, sky burials or sacred marriages, liver reading or mystery initiations, ancient peoples were constantly seeking ways to maintain conscious connection with the divine forces they believed guided and shaped their world. Their practices may seem strange to us now, but they reflected a profound understanding that human life gains meaning through relationship with something larger than individual existence, something sacred that connects all beings in a web of mutual responsibility and care. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine yourself in those ancient temples and sacred groves, breathing the incense that carried prayers toward the stars, feeling the presence of the divine in every stone and stream and gust of wind. These ancient mystics understood something that we are still learning, that consciousness itself is sacred, that the boundary between the human and divine is thinner than we usually imagine, that in quiet moments of receptivity, we too can touch the eternal mystery that flows through all things. In the darkness before dawn, on a rooftop in ancient Babylon, a priest sits perfectly still, watching the eastern horizon. He has been doing this for decades, recording the precise moment when Venus appears as the morning star, tracking its movements through the zodiac, noting how its cycles relate to the flooding of rivers and the timing of harvests. Around him, clay tablets hold thousands of observations stretching back for centuries, a record of celestial patterns that reveals the mathematical heart of the cosmos. These Babylonian astronomers discovered something remarkable. Eclipses, which seemed like random acts of divine anger to most ancient peoples, actually followed predictable cycles. The moon's shadow would fall across the earth every 673 days, or every 875 days, following patterns so precise that they could be calculated centuries in advance. The priests developed mathematical tables that could predict eclipses with an accuracy that would not be surpassed until the invention of modern computers. But they went even further. They mapped the wandering stars we call planets, tracking their complex movements against the background of fixed constellations. They discovered that Mars returns to the same position relative to the stars every 780 days. Jupiter completes its circuit in nearly 12 years. Saturn takes almost 30 years to return to where it started. These were not just astronomical curiosities, but practical tools for navigation, agriculture, and governance. The mathematical sophistication required for these calculations was extraordinary. Babylonian astronomers worked with enormous numbers, tracking cycles that lasted thousands of years. They developed mathematical techniques for handling fractions and remainders that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Their eclipse predictions were so accurate that modern astronomers use Babylonian records to study how the Earth's rotation has changed over the past 2.5 millennia. Far across the ocean, Maya astronomers were making equally remarkable discoveries. In the jungles of Central America, they built observatories with windows precisely aligned to track the movements of Venus through its 584-day cycle. Venus was more than just a celestial object to the Maya. It was the god Kukulkan, whose appearances and disappearances marked the proper times for warfare, planting, and religious ceremonies. Maya priests calculated that Venus would return to exactly the same position relative to Earth and Sun every 8 years. They discovered that 5 Venus cycles equal exactly 8 Earth years, a mathematical relationship they called the Venus round. Their calendars wove together multiple cycles, tracking not just Venus but the Moon, Mars, and the complex astronomical periods that governed Maya spiritual and practical life. The precision of Maya astronomy staggers the imagination. They calculated the length of the solar year as 365.2420 days, a figure that differs from our modern measurement by only 17 seconds. They predicted eclipses, tracked the heliacal rising of stars, and created calendars that could accurately place any date within cycles lasting over 5 million years. All of this without metal tools, without the wheel, without telescopes, or any of the instruments we consider essential for serious astronomical work. Maya observatories were architectural marvels designed to frame specific celestial events. At Chichen Itza, the Caracol Observatory has windows that align perfectly with the extreme positions of Venus on the horizon. At Zoltan, recently discovered murals show astronomers working with calculations that extend Maya calendars thousands of years into the future. These were not casual skywatchers but professional scientists whose livelihood depended on the accuracy of their predictions. In Egypt, astronomy took a different form but was no less sophisticated. The pyramids of Giza are aligned with cardinal directions so precisely that modern surveyors marvel at the accuracy. The Great Pyramid points to true north with an error of only 3/60ths of a degree, a precision that requires both advanced mathematical knowledge and extremely careful observation of stellar positions. But Egyptian astronomy was not just about building monuments. It was about creating a calendar that could predict the annual flooding of the Nile, the event on which all Egyptian agriculture depended. Egyptian astronomers discovered that the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet, disappeared from the dawn sky for exactly 70 days each year. Its reappearance, called the heliacal rising, coincided almost perfectly with the beginning of the flood season. This discovery allowed Egyptian farmers to plan their agricultural year with remarkable precision. They knew exactly when to expect the floodwaters, when to plant their crops, when to harvest their grain. The calendar based on Sirius had 365 days, very close to the actual length of the solar year. Over centuries, this small discrepancy would cause the calendar to drift slightly, but Egyptian astronomers tracked this drift and developed correction factors to keep their calendar aligned with the seasons. Egyptian sun temples represent perhaps the most elegant fusion of architecture and astronomy in the ancient world. At Abu Simbel, the great temple of Ramesses II is positioned so that twice each year, sunlight penetrates the entire length of the temple and illuminates the statue of the pharaoh in the innermost sanctuary. These illuminations occur on February 20th and October 20th, dates that may correspond to Ramesses' birthday and coronation. Similar solar alignments exist throughout Egypt. The temple at Karnak has a long corridor that frames the sunrise on the winter solstice. The temple at Dendar is oriented to the heliacal rising of Sirius. These were not accidents, but careful calculations, requiring astronomers to work closely with architects to create buildings that would capture specific celestial events and hold them like prayers carved in stone. Perhaps the most mysterious astronomical knowledge in the ancient world belongs to the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa. French anthropologists studying Dogon mythology in the 1940s were astonished to discover that these people, who had no telescopes and lived far from any center of modern astronomy, possessed detailed knowledge about Sirius B, a white dwarf star so faint that it was not discovered by European astronomers until 1862 and could not be photographed until 1970. According to Dogon tradition, Sirius has a companion star that is invisible to the naked eye but extremely heavy and important to the structure of the cosmos. They call this companion Po-Tolo, the grain star, and say that it orbits Sirius every 50 years. Modern astronomy confirms that Sirius B does indeed orbit Sirius A with a period of 50.09 years. The Dogon also knew that Sirius B is made of matter so dense that a small piece of it would weigh more than all the iron on Earth, a description that perfectly matches our understanding of white dwarf stars. How did the Dogon acquire this knowledge? The question has puzzled astronomers and anthropologists for decades. Some suggest that they may have inherited ancient wisdom from earlier civilizations. Others propose that their shamanic traditions included practices that somehow allowed them to perceive astronomical realities hidden from ordinary sight. Still others argue that Dogon astronomy represents a form of intuitive knowledge that developed through centuries of careful observation and spiritual insight. Regardless of how they acquired it, Dogon astronomy demonstrates that sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics was not limited to civilizations with written records and monumental architecture. Even peoples living traditional lifestyles in remote locations could develop astronomical knowledge that rivals or exceeds that of more technologically advanced societies. Ancient astronomy was never just about understanding the sky for its own sake. It was about finding humanity's place in the cosmic order, about discovering the mathematical principles that govern both earthly and celestial phenomena. Ancient astronomers understood that the same forces that move the planets also influence the tides, the seasons, the growth of plants, and the rhythms of human life. Their observations revealed a universe that was not chaotic but ordered, not random but predictable, not separate from human affairs but intimately connected to everything that happens on Earth. They discovered that time itself has structure, that celestial cycles provide a framework within which human history unfolds, that consciousness and cosmos are partners in a dance that has been going on since the beginning of time. These ancient astronomers were the first scientists, using careful observation and mathematical analysis to understand natural phenomena. But they were also philosophers and poets, finding in the movements of stars and planets a source of meaning that connected human existence to the vast scales of cosmic time. Their work reminds us that science and spirituality need not be enemies, that the search for factual knowledge can also be a search for wonder, beauty, and our place in the grand scheme of things. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine yourself lying on your back in an ancient observatory, watching the slow wheel of stars turn overhead. Feel the presence of those patient astronomers who spent their lives tracking celestial cycles, who found in the predictable movements of planets a kind of cosmic music, a harmony that suggests the universe itself is conscious, intelligent, and filled with meaning waiting to be discovered. They were the architects of time, and their blueprints still guide us as we navigate our way through the infinite mystery of existence. Beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, in a shipwreck that had lain undisturbed for over 2,000 years, divers discovered what may be the most extraordinary artifact of the ancient world. Corroded and encrusted with marine growth, it looked like nothing more than a lump of bronze and wood. But when researchers began to clean and study this mysterious object, they realized they were looking at something that should not have existed, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about ancient technology. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, is an analog computer of breathtaking complexity. Inside its bronze case, dozens of precisely cut gears mesh together in ratios that mirror the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. Turn a crank on the side, and bronze pointers move across graduated dials, showing the positions of celestial bodies for any date in the past or future. It could predict eclipses, calculate the timing of Olympic Games, and track the complex cycles that governed ancient Greek religious and civic life. The mathematical sophistication required to design this device staggers the imagination. The gear ratios needed to represent planetary movements involve calculations with numbers in the hundreds of thousands. The mechanism includes a lunar calendar that accounts for the irregular orbit of the Moon, an innovation that requires understanding of astronomical phenomena that would not be rediscovered until the time of Johannes Kepler. It represents a level of mechanical engineering that would not be seen again in Europe until the development of astronomical clocks in medieval cathedrals more than 1,000 years later. But the Antikythera mechanism was not unique. Ancient Greek texts refer to similar devices built by famous inventors and mathematicians. Cicero wrote about a bronze sphere constructed by Archimedes that showed the movements of sun, moon, and planets with mechanical precision. Other sources mention automatic theaters where bronze figures acted out mythological scenes, powered by hidden gears and counterweights. The mechanism found in the shipwreck may have been just one example of a sophisticated tradition of mechanical engineering that has otherwise been lost to time. Ancient Greek engineering achieved marvels that seem almost magical to modern observers. The Pantheon in Rome, built during the reign of Hadrian, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever constructed. Its proportions are so perfect that a sphere would fit exactly within its interior space. The dome was cast in a single pour using concrete that becomes lighter toward the top, incorporating pumice and other lightweight materials to reduce the stress on the structure. The building has stood for nearly 2,000 years, surviving earthquakes that have toppled more recent constructions. But perhaps no ancient innovation was more impressive than the development of surgical instruments that rival modern tools in their precision and effectiveness. Obsidian scalpels, made by skillfully knapping volcanic glass, can achieve cutting edges only a few molecules thick. These blades are actually sharper than modern steel surgical instruments, causing less trauma to tissue and promoting faster healing. Some surgeons today use obsidian scalpels for delicate operations where the utmost precision is required. Ancient surgeons understood anatomy with remarkable accuracy. Egyptian papyri describe surgical procedures for treating head injuries, setting broken bones, and removing tumors. Indian physicians developed cataract surgery, using curved needles to extract clouded lenses from patients' eyes. Roman military surgeons performed amputations with survival rates that would not be exceeded until the development of antiseptic techniques in the 19th century. The sophistication of ancient medical knowledge extended beyond surgery to include pharmacology that was based on thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. The ancient Egyptians used willow bark to treat pain and inflammation, unknowingly extracting the same active compound that would later be synthesized as aspirin. They used honey as an antibiotic, applying it to wounds to prevent infection. They understood the importance of cleanliness in medical practice, washing their hands and sterilizing their instruments in ways that would not become standard in European medicine until the time of Joseph Lister. Ancient Chinese medicine developed acupuncture, a system for treating illness by inserting thin needles at specific points on the body. To modern scientific understanding, acupuncture works by stimulating the nervous system in ways that can reduce pain, improve circulation, and promote healing. but ancient Chinese physicians understood these effects without any knowledge of modern neuroscience, developing through careful observation and experimentation a medical technique that is still used effectively today. Perhaps nowhere was ancient innovation more impressive than in the field of construction and engineering. The Harappan civilization, which flourished in the Indus Valley over 4,000 years ago, developed a system of standardized brick-making that ensured uniform quality across their vast territory. Bricks made in cities hundreds of miles apart were identical in size and composition, suggesting a level of industrial organization and quality control that would not be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. Harappan engineers also created some of the world's first urban planning standards. Their cities were laid out on grid patterns with wide main streets and narrower side streets. They built covered sewers that could handle both human waste and stormwater runoff. Every major building had access to fresh water through a system of public wells and private bathrooms connected to the city's drainage network. The level of public health infrastructure in Harappan cities would not be matched in Europe until the 19th century. Ancient Roman engineers pushed the boundaries of what was possible with the materials and techniques available to them. They built aqueducts that carried fresh water across hundreds of miles, using precisely calculated gradients to maintain steady flow without pumps or other mechanical assistance. The aqueduct serving the city of Nimes in France drops only 56 feet over its entire 31-mile length, a gradient so gentle that it requires extraordinary precision in surveying and construction. Roman concrete was in many ways superior to modern versions. It was made with volcanic ash that reacted chemically with lime to create a material that actually became stronger over time. Roman concrete structures have survived for 2,000 years in marine environments that would destroy modern concrete within decades. Recent research has shown that Roman concrete contains microscopic crystals that can seal cracks automatically, giving the material self-healing properties that we are still trying to understand and replicate. But ancient innovations were not limited to grand engineering projects. Everyday objects often incorporated ingenious design solutions that demonstrate deep understanding of materials science and manufacturing techniques. Roman glassmakers developed techniques for creating vessels so thin they were almost transparent, yet strong enough for daily use. They learned to add different minerals to glass while it was molten, creating colors that ranged from deep blue to brilliant gold. Ancient metalworkers achieved effects that modern craftsmen struggle to duplicate. Damascus steel, forged in the Middle East during medieval times but based on techniques that may date back thousands of years, incorporated carbon nanotubes that gave the steel extraordinary strength and flexibility. The exact process for making Damascus steel was lost centuries ago, and despite extensive research, modern metallurgists have not been able to fully reproduce its properties. Perhaps most remarkably, ancient peoples developed sophisticated understanding of acoustics and used this knowledge to create architectural spaces with extraordinary sound properties. The theatre at Epidaurus in Greece, built in the 4th century BC, has acoustics so perfect that a whisper spoken on stage can be heard clearly in the back row, 300 feet away. The design achieves this effect through careful calculation of angles and proportions, creating a space where sound waves are naturally amplified and focused. Similar acoustic engineering can be found in sacred sites around the world. The corbelled chambers at Newgrange in Ireland, built over 5,000 years ago, create resonance effects that amplify certain frequencies while dampening others. Chanting or drumming in these chambers produces sound effects that seem otherworldly, suggesting that ancient builders understood how to use architecture to create specific psychological and spiritual experiences. Ancient knowledge was not always preserved in written form. Much of it was embedded in craft traditions that were passed down from master to apprentice through hands-on practice. Potters learned to achieve specific colors and textures through techniques that involved precise control of temperature, timing, and atmospheric conditions. Weavers developed patterns and dye techniques that created textiles of extraordinary beauty and durability. Metalworkers mastered alloys and heat treatments that produced tools and weapons with properties that seemed almost magical to those who did not understand the underlying science. The loss of this craft knowledge represents one of humanity's great tragedies. When civilizations collapsed or were conquered, the accumulated wisdom of generations of skilled practitioners often disappeared forever. We can study the products of ancient craftsmanship, but we cannot always understand how they were made. The techniques used to create certain ancient textiles, ceramics, and metal objects remain mysteries despite intensive research, yet the legacy of ancient innovation lives on in ways both obvious and subtle. Every time we use concrete, we are building on Roman innovations. Every time we navigate by the stars, we are using knowledge first developed by ancient astronomers. Every time we take aspirin for a headache, we are benefiting from Egyptian understanding of plant medicine. The foundations of our technological civilization were laid by ancient minds whose curiosity and ingenuity were no less than our own. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine the hands of ancient craftsmen shaping clay and metal, glass and stone, creating objects that would outlast empires and carry their knowledge forward through millennia. Feel the presence of ancient engineers calculating the curves of domes and the flow of water, ancient physicians studying the human body and learning to heal its ailments, ancient inventors dreaming up mechanical solutions to practical problems. Their tools have changed, but their curiosity, their creativity, their fundamental drive to understand and improve the world around them burns as bright today as it did 5,000 years ago. They were the architects of human possibility, and their greatest creation was not any particular device or technique, but the very idea that human intelligence can transform the world through careful observation, bold experimentation, and patient refinement of knowledge passed down through generations. Picture a caravan at dawn somewhere in the vast expanse between Samarkand and Baghdad. Camels snort and shuffle as their loads are checked one final time. Merchants from a dozen different lands speak in languages that mix and flow like water finding its course. Chinese silk wraps around Roman gold coins. Indian spices fill leather pouches sewn by Persian craftsmen. And orchestrating this complex dance of goods and languages, cultures and currencies are the Sogdians, the forgotten masters of ancient trade. For over 1,000 years, Sogdian merchants served as the invisible threads connecting East and West. They spoke Chinese with Tang dynasty officials, Arabic with Abbasid caliphs, and Greek with Byzantine traders. They established trading posts that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the Black Sea, creating a network of commercial relationships that made the ancient world smaller, more connected, more aware of its own diversity and potential. The Sogdians understood something that modern economists are still learning, that successful trade requires more than just buying and selling goods. It requires trust, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to navigate complex social and political relationships across vast distances. Sogdian merchants often spent years in foreign cities, learning local customs, building relationships with suppliers and customers, becoming integral parts of the communities where they worked. Their trading posts were more than just commercial establishments. They were cultural embassies where ideas traveled alongside goods. Buddhist monks followed Sogdian trade routes, carrying their religion from India to China. Islamic scholars used Sogdian networks to spread mathematical and scientific knowledge. Christian missionaries found safe passage along routes established by Sogdian merchants. The Silk Road was not just a highway for commerce, but a conduit for the flow of human knowledge and spiritual insight. But the Sogdians were not the only master traders of the ancient world. In the highlands of Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum built a commercial empire that connected 3 continents. Aksumite merchants sailed the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, trading with Egypt and Byzantium to the north, Persia and India to the east, and the mysterious lands beyond the sources of the Nile to the south. Aksum's wealth came from its position at the crossroads of Africa, Arabia, and the broader Indian Ocean world. Ethiopian merchants exported gold, ivory, and exotic animals to Roman amphitheaters and Chinese imperial courts. They imported silk from China, spices from India, and luxury goods from throughout the Mediterranean world. But perhaps most importantly, they served as intermediaries in the trade between the Roman Empire and Han Dynasty China, 2 superpowers that rarely dealt with each other directly. The coins minted in Aksum tell the story of this commercial sophistication. Aksumite gold pieces were accepted as currency throughout Arabia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean trading world. They bore inscriptions in Greek, the language of international commerce, and later in Ge'ez, the local Ethiopian language. The design and weight of these coins were carefully calibrated to match the currency standards used in different trading regions, making them welcome wherever Aksumite merchants traveled. Aksumite trading expeditions were elaborate affairs that could last for years. Merchants would sail down the Red Sea to ports in Yemen and Oman, then continue across the Indian Ocean to trading centers in India and Sri Lanka. Some expeditions reached as far as the Malay Peninsula and the South China Sea. These were not simple buying trips, but complex diplomatic and commercial missions that required skills in navigation, negotiation, and cultural adaptation. The infrastructure that supported these ancient trade networks was as sophisticated as any modern transportation system. The Roman postal service, the cursus publicus, maintained relay stations every 10 to 12 miles along major highways throughout the empire. Fresh horses were always available for official messengers, who could travel from Rome to Britain or from Egypt to Syria with unprecedented speed and reliability. But the cursus publicus was more than just a mail system. It was an information superhighway that allowed news, orders, and intelligence to flow rapidly across vast distances. Provincial governors could communicate with the imperial court in real time. Military commanders could coordinate complex operations across multiple theaters. Merchants could send letters of credit that would be honored in distant cities. The system created a level of administrative and commercial integration that would not be matched again until the development of modern telecommunications. The Romans also developed sophisticated methods for long-distance communication that did not rely on written messages. Signal fires, lit on mountain peaks and tall towers, could carry news across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. The system was so well organized that a message could travel from Britain to Rome faster than a mounted messenger could cover the same distance. During military campaigns, these fire signals allowed commanders to coordinate movements and respond to changing situations with remarkable speed. Greek city-states had developed similar communication networks centuries earlier. Torch signals were used to convey complex messages across the mountainous terrain of the Greek peninsula. Different combinations of torches could represent letters or numbers, allowing for detailed communications about military movements, political decisions, and commercial opportunities. These optical telegraph systems were the ancestors of all long-distance communication technologies that followed, but perhaps the most remarkable aspect of ancient trade was the way it connected civilizations that had no direct contact with each other. Chinese silk found its way to Roman senators who had no idea where it came from. Roman glass appeared in Chinese tombs whose occupants had never heard of the Mediterranean. Indian spices flavored Persian dishes prepared by cooks who knew nothing of the monsoon regions where the spices grew. This indirect trade created a kind of global economy thousands of years before the term was invented. A drought in China could affect prices in Rome. A war in Central Asia could disrupt trade throughout the Indian Ocean. Political changes in one region could send ripple effects across continents as merchants adapted their routes and strategies to changing conditions. The economic relationships created by these trade networks were often surprisingly sophisticated. Credit instruments allowed merchants to conduct business without carrying large amounts of precious metal across dangerous routes. A merchant in Alexandria could deposit silver with a banker and receive a letter of credit that could be honored by associated bankers in Bangalore or Kashgar. These early banking networks operated on principles of trust and reputation that spanned continents and cultures. Insurance concepts also emerged from the practical needs of long-distance trade. Merchants who pooled their resources to outfit trading expeditions were essentially creating primitive insurance companies, spreading the risks of loss due to storms, bandits, or political upheaval. If one caravan was lost, the investors would share the loss. If the expedition was successful, they would share the profits. These risk-sharing arrangements made possible trading ventures that would have been too dangerous for individual merchants to undertake. The goods that traveled these ancient routes carried more than just economic value. They carried stories, techniques, and ideas that transformed the cultures that received them. Chinese paper-making techniques traveled west along the Silk Road, revolutionizing communication and record-keeping throughout the Islamic world and eventually Europe. Islamic mathematical concepts, including the use of zero and decimal notation, spread in all directions along trade routes, transforming commerce and science wherever they went. Artistic styles also traveled along trade routes, creating fascinating hybrids and fusion cultures. Gandharan art from the borderlands between India and Afghanistan shows clear Greek influence, reflecting the cultural mixing that occurred in major trading centers. Chinese ceramics found in East African ports show Islamic decorative influences, evidence of the complex cultural exchanges that occurred in Indian Ocean trading cities. Food was perhaps the most visible way that trade transformed daily life. Spices that we now consider essential to certain cuisines were originally exotic imports that arrived along ancient trade routes. Chili peppers, native to the Americas, transformed Asian and African cooking after being introduced by European traders. Rice, originally from Asia, became a staple crop in Africa and the Mediterranean through ancient trading relationships. Sugar, first cultivated in New Guinea, spread throughout the Old World via trading networks that connected the Pacific Islands to the civilizations of Asia and the Middle East. The human stories behind these trade networks are often lost to history, but occasionally glimpses survive in ancient letters and documents. We have correspondence between Sogdian merchants separated by thousands of miles, discussing family matters alongside business concerns. We have Egyptian papyri that record the anxiety of traders waiting for delayed shipments from India. We have Chinese travel accounts that describe the wonder of encountering foreign cultures and customs for the first time. These ancient traders were among the first true cosmopolitans, people who felt at home in multiple cultures and who served as bridges between different ways of understanding the world. They learned to adapt their behavior, their dress, and even their religious practices to fit local customs. They developed a kind of cultural fluency that allowed them to navigate the complex social landscapes of the ancient world with skill and sensitivity. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine the sounds of those ancient trading centers, the polyglot conversations in market squares from Kashgar to Zanzibar, the creak of camel saddles and the splash of oars as goods and ideas flowed along routes that connected the entire inhabited world. Picture the merchants who spent their lives in motion, carrying not just silk and spices, but stories and songs, mathematical theorems and religious insights, techniques for making better tools and recipes for preparing new foods. They were the neurons in the nervous system of ancient civilization, carrying information and innovation across synapses of desert and ocean, mountain and river. Through their patient work, the ancient world became one world, connected by invisible threads of trade and trust that made all of human culture richer, more complex, and more aware of its own wonderful diversity. On a dark ocean thousands of miles from any land, a Polynesian navigator lies on his back in the bottom of a sailing canoe, feeling the rhythm of swells that began their journey on distant shores. His eyes are closed, but he is reading the sea with his entire body. The subtle lift and roll of the vessel tells him stories about islands he has never seen, currents that flow between them, winds that carry the scent of flowers blooming on atolls beyond the horizon. This is navigation without instruments, without charts, without any of the tools we consider essential for finding our way across trackless water. It is navigation as a form of meditation, a way of becoming so attuned to the natural world that the ocean itself becomes a map, readable by those who have learned its language through years of patient practice and ancestral wisdom. The Polynesian navigators, called Wayfinders, developed perhaps the most sophisticated system of ocean navigation ever created. They could sail from island to island across thousands of miles of open Pacific, guided only by their understanding of wave patterns, star positions, cloud formations, and the behavior of seabirds. Their knowledge was not written down but embodied, passed from master to student through oral tradition and hands-on experience that created an almost mystical connection between navigator and sea. Wave navigation was the heart of their system. Ocean swells travel in straight lines for thousands of miles, bending and reflecting when they encounter islands, creating patterns that experienced navigators could read like fingerprints. Each island group created its own distinctive wave signature. Swells would wrap around islands, creating areas of confused water on the lee side. They would reflect off underwater reefs, creating standing waves that could be felt long before the reef itself became visible. Polynesian navigators learned to distinguish between different types of swells, to feel the subtle differences that indicated direction, distance, and the presence of land. They could detect the reflection patterns created by islands that were still below the horizon, sometimes sensing land from distances of 30 or 40 miles. This wave reading was so precise that navigators could determine not just the presence of an island, but its approximate size and the direction of its beaches. Star navigation provided the framework within which wave navigation operated. Polynesian wayfinders memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, creating mental maps of the night sky that served as their compass and calendar. They knew exactly which stars would appear above specific islands at different times of year, allowing them to maintain course even when land was far out of sight. But Polynesian star navigation was more complex than simple direction finding. Navigators understood the concept of the star compass, a mental system that divided the horizon into 32 different directional segments, each associated with specific stars and their rising or setting points. They could determine their position by observing which stars were directly overhead, a technique that required extraordinary knowledge of stellar movements and precise timing. The oral traditions that preserved this knowledge were themselves marvels of human memory and cultural transmission. Master navigators would recite chants that contained sailing directions for journeys of thousands of miles, poetry that encoded information about currents, weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the characteristics of different island groups. These chants served as both practical sailing guides and sacred songs that connected the navigator to ancestral wisdom and spiritual power. Training to become a wayfinder was a lifelong commitment that began in childhood. Young students would spend years learning to feel wave patterns while lying in shallow water near shore. They would practice identifying stars and memorizing their movements throughout the year. They would study the behavior of different species of seabirds, learning which ones indicated nearby land and which ones were simply feeding at sea. The psychological aspects of Polynesian navigation were as important as the technical skills. Wayfinders had to develop extraordinary concentration and sensory awareness, maintaining focus for days or weeks while crossing open ocean. They learned meditation techniques that allowed them to enter altered states of consciousness where they could perceive subtle environmental cues that would normally be below the threshold of awareness. Modern researchers have attempted to understand Polynesian navigation through scientific analysis, using instruments to measure wave patterns and computer models to simulate ocean conditions. While this research has confirmed the accuracy of traditional techniques, it has also revealed the limits of purely intellectual understanding. The knowledge of the Wayfinders was not just about facts and techniques, but about a way of being in relationship with the natural world that cannot easily be reduced to scientific formulas. The psychological preparation for long ocean voyages required navigators to develop what anthropologists call expanded awareness, a state of consciousness where the boundaries between self and environment become fluid. In this state, navigators reported feeling that they were not so much traveling across the ocean as remaining stationary while the islands moved toward them. This perspective shift may have helped them maintain the precise attention to environmental cues that successful navigation required. Polynesian navigation also depended on understanding atmospheric phenomena that could provide information about distant land. Clouds behave differently over islands than over open ocean, creating formations that experienced navigators could read from great distances. High cumulus clouds often form over mountains, while green tints in the undersides of clouds can indicate the reflection of sunlight from shallow lagoons. The flight patterns of seabirds also provided crucial information, as different species have different ranges and behaviors that can indicate the direction and distance to land. The canoes used for these epic voyages were themselves marvels of marine engineering. Polynesian voyaging canoes, called wa'a kaulua in Hawaiian, were double-hulled vessels that could carry crews of 20 or more people along with supplies for journeys lasting weeks or months. The twin hulls provided stability in rough seas, while the connecting platform offered space for passengers, cargo, and the sacred objects that were essential for successful navigation. These vessels were built without metal tools, using techniques that had been refined over centuries of experimentation and refinement. The hulls were carved from single trees and fitted together with coconut fiber lashings that allowed the structure to flex with ocean swells without breaking. The sails were woven from pandanus leaves in patterns that could catch wind efficiently while remaining stable in changing conditions. The provisioning of voyaging canoes required careful planning and sophisticated food preservation techniques. Fresh water was stored in gourds and bamboo containers, supplemented by coconuts that provided both liquid and nutrition. Dried fish, fermented breadfruit, and preserved taro provided protein and carbohydrates that could last for weeks at sea. Some voyages also carried live pigs and chickens, animals that would become breeding stock for new settlements. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Polynesian navigation was its role in one of humanity's greatest migration stories. Over the course of several thousand years, Polynesian voyagers discovered and settled virtually every habitable island in the Pacific Ocean, from Easter Island in the east to New Zealand in the south. This expansion covered an area larger than all the continents combined, accomplished entirely in sailing vessels guided by traditional navigation techniques. The scale of this achievement becomes clear when you consider the challenges involved. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of the Earth's surface, and many of the islands that Polynesian navigators discovered are tiny specks of land separated by thousands of miles of open water. Finding these islands required not just skill but extraordinary courage and faith in traditional knowledge systems that had been developed over generations of oceanic exploration. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that Polynesian navigators may have reached the Americas centuries before European contact, carrying sweet potatoes and other crops back to Polynesia from South American shores. DNA studies of chickens found on Pacific islands show genetic links to South American populations, supporting theories that Polynesian voyagers established regular contact across the entire Pacific basin. The precision of Polynesian navigation is demonstrated by the fact that return voyages were regularly made between island groups separated by thousands of miles. This was not random exploration, but systematic travel along well-established routes that connected far-flung communities in a vast oceanic civilization. The navigators who accomplished these voyages possessed geographical knowledge that rivals modern GPS systems in its accuracy and far exceeds it in its integration with natural phenomena. Modern attempts to recreate Polynesian voyaging have used traditionally built canoes sailed by navigators trained in traditional techniques. These experimental voyages have successfully crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, confirming the accuracy of traditional navigation methods while also revealing the extraordinary skill and endurance required to use them effectively. The legacy of Polynesian navigation extends far beyond its historical significance. It represents a fundamentally different way of understanding human relationship with the natural world, one based on intimate knowledge, patient observation, and deep respect for environmental processes. In an age when GPS satellites and electronic charts have made traditional navigation skills seem obsolete, the example of Polynesian Wayfinders reminds us that there are other ways of knowing, other forms of intelligence that connect us more directly to the world around us. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine yourself in that voyaging canoe, feeling the rhythm of ancient swells beneath you, watching constellations wheel overhead in patterns that have guided travelers for thousands of years. Feel the presence of those master navigators who learned to read the ocean like a book, who trusted in knowledge passed down through generations of seafaring ancestors, who found their way across impossible distances guided by nothing more than careful attention to the subtle signs that nature provides to those who know how to listen. They were the ultimate explorers, carrying human consciousness to the farthest reaches of our oceanic planet, proving that with enough patience, skill, and respect for natural processes, there are no limits to where human curiosity and courage can take us. In the frozen tombs of the Altai Mountains, where permafrost has preserved what time usually destroys, archaeologists have uncovered burial chambers that seem to glow with ancient gold. Here lie the Scythian warriors, nomadic peoples who ruled the steppes for over 1,000 years, their bodies adorned with treasures that speak of lives lived at the intersection of violence and beauty, power and art. The most famous of these burials belongs to a warrior whose body was covered in intricate tattoos that still show clearly on his preserved skin. Fantastic animals spiral across his arms and torso, mythical creatures that seem to dance between the worlds of the living and the dead. These are not random decorations but carefully planned spiritual maps, symbols that were believed to guide the soul through the dangers of the afterlife and ensure safe passage to the realm of the ancestors. Beside this tattooed warrior lay weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship. Gold-handled knives with blades so sharp they could split silk, bows made from horn and sinew that could drive arrows through armor at distances that amazed even their enemies, bronze battle axes decorated with scenes of eagles hunting wolves, eternal struggles between sky and earth captured in metal that would outlast the civilizations that feared these mounted archers. But perhaps most remarkable were the golden objects that filled these tombs. Not just jewelry or decorative items, but elaborate narrative sculptures that told stories of Scythian mythology and belief. Golden deer with antlers that transformed into birds in flight, golden panthers whose spots became spiraling galaxies of smaller animals, golden fish whose scales were actually tiny human figures, as if the Scythians understood that all life flows from the same cosmic source and returns to it in endless cycles of transformation. The Scythians were master metalworkers whose techniques created effects that modern jewelers struggle to replicate. They developed methods for creating granulation, covering gold surfaces with thousands of tiny spheres so small they look like glittering dust. They perfected cloisonné techniques that allowed them to create complex, multicolored designs using different metals and gemstones. Their work demonstrates an understanding of metallurgy and design that represents one of the highest achievements of ancient craftsmanship. But Scythian burials also contained more mysterious objects, leather pouches filled with seeds from cannabis plants, along with bronze vessels that appear to have been designed for burning aromatic substances. Ancient Greek historians described Scythian rituals involving vapor baths that produced altered states of consciousness, spiritual practices that may have been central to their religious and military culture. The archaeological evidence suggests that Scythian warriors used psychoactive substances as part of their preparation for battle and their communication with the spirit world. These cannabis-filled tombs raise fascinating questions about the role of consciousness-altering substances in ancient warfare and spirituality. Did Scythian warriors enter battle in altered states that enhanced their courage and reduced their fear of death? Were their shamanic leaders able to achieve visionary experiences that guided military and political decisions? The presence of these materials in the most elite burials suggests that the ability to navigate non-ordinary states of consciousness was considered a mark of power and prestige. Far to the west, in the Celtic lands of Britain and Ireland, a different kind of power symbol dominated the archaeological record. Celtic torques, twisted collars of gold and silver that were worn around the neck, represent one of the most distinctive and mysterious forms of ancient jewelry. These were not simple ornaments, but complex symbols of status, spirituality, and connection to divine power. Celtic torques were worn by both men and women, but they seem to have held special significance for warriors and religious leaders. Roman writers described Celtic chieftains wearing golden torques into battle, treating these neck rings as both armor and sacred protection. The torques were believed to channel divine energy, connecting the wearer to the gods of war and wisdom who governed Celtic spiritual life. The craftsmanship required to create these torques was extraordinary. Celtic metal workers developed techniques for twisting multiple strands of gold or silver into complex patterns that could only be achieved through precise mathematical planning and years of skilled practice. Some torques were made from single pieces of metal twisted into spiraling forms. Others were constructed from multiple components fitted together with joints so perfect they seemed to flow seamlessly from one section to another. The symbolic meaning of Celtic torques remains partially mysterious, but they clearly represented more than just wealth or status. The twisted spiral patterns that characterize many torques echo motifs found throughout Celtic art, designs that may represent the cyclical nature of time, the connection between earth and sky, or the spiraling path that souls follow between death and rebirth. Wearing a torque was a way of embodying these cosmic principles, of becoming a living symbol of the forces that governed Celtic understanding of reality. Archaeological evidence suggests that torques were often buried or deposited in sacred places rather than being passed down as family heirlooms. Hoards of torques have been found in bogs, lakes, and springs throughout the Celtic world, suggesting that these powerful objects were sometimes returned to the earth or water as offerings to the gods. This practice indicates that torques were not just personal possessions but sacred objects whose power needed to be carefully managed and occasionally returned to its divine source. Celtic burial practices reveal sophisticated understanding of gender roles and social organization that challenges many modern assumptions about ancient societies. Some of the richest Celtic graves belong to women who were buried with weapons, indicating that female warriors held positions of respect and authority. Other female burials contain elaborate jewelry and religious objects, suggesting that women served as priestesses and spiritual leaders with significant social power. The famous Vix burial in France contains the grave of a woman who was buried wearing a massive golden torque and surrounded by luxury goods from across the ancient world. Greek wine vessels, Etruscan bronze work, and Celtic gold jewelry were placed in her tomb, indicating that she held a position that connected her to trade networks spanning continents. This was clearly not just a wealthy individual, but someone whose authority extended far beyond her local community. Similarly, the warrior graves at Scythian sites reveal that some of the most elaborately equipped burials belong to women who were interred with bows, arrows, and battle axes. These archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of gender roles in nomadic societies, showing that women could achieve positions of military and political leadership that were denied to them in many settled civilizations. The symbolic language of ancient power was not limited to personal ornaments and weapons. Monumental architecture also served as a way of communicating authority, spiritual connection, and cultural values. The massive stone circles of Britain and Ireland, the elaborate burial mounds of the Scythian steppes, and the golden face masks found in Mycenaean graves all represent attempts to create lasting symbols of power that would continue to communicate long after their creators had died. These monuments required enormous investments of labor and resources, demonstrating the ability of ancient leaders to mobilize community effort on a massive scale. But they also reveal sophisticated understanding of astronomy, engineering, and symbolic design. Stonehenge is aligned with celestial events that mark the changing seasons. Scythian burial mounds are positioned to be visible from great distances across the steppe landscape. Mycenaean tholos tombs use corbelled construction techniques that create interior spaces of cathedral-like grandeur. The psychological impact of these monuments was as important as their practical function. They were designed to inspire awe, to make ordinary people feel small in the presence of forces larger than individual human existence. They communicated the power of their builders, not through explicit messages, but through the emotional responses they evoked in those who encountered them. Ancient rulers understood that power was not just about controlling resources or commanding armies. It was about shaping the symbolic landscape in ways that influenced how people thought about authority, spirituality, and their place in the cosmic order. The golden treasures of Scythian tombs, the twisted spirals of Celtic torques, and the astronomical alignments of megalithic monuments all served this deeper purpose of creating shared meanings that could bind communities together and justify the concentration of power in particular individuals or groups. The durability of these power symbols speaks to their creators' understanding of immortality and legacy. Ancient rulers were not content to exercise authority only during their lifetimes. They wanted to create objects and monuments that would continue to communicate their power long after death, that would serve as permanent reminders of their achievements and their connection to divine forces. This desire for lasting symbolic presence led to some of humanity's greatest artistic and architectural achievements. The golden treasures preserved in frozen tombs, the massive stones arranged in perfect circles, the intricate metalwork that captures light and holds it like crystallized sunlight, all represent attempts to transcend the limitations of individual mortality through the creation of enduring beauty. Modern excavations of these ancient power symbols continue to reveal new insights into the complexity of ancient societies and the sophisticated ways they understood the relationship between material objects and spiritual meaning. Each discovery adds new pieces to our understanding of how ancient peoples used art, architecture, and precious materials to create symbolic systems that could communicate across languages, cultures, and centuries. As you settle into sleep tonight, imagine the weight of a golden torque around your neck, the spiral patterns pressing against your skin, like a reminder of cosmic forces that connect all living things. Picture the Scythian warriors riding across endless grasslands, their bodies marked with tattoos that served as maps for spiritual journeys. their weapons gleaming with the same gold that caught the light of sunset over the steppes. Feel the presence of ancient rulers and warriors, priests and priestesses, all working to create objects of lasting beauty that could carry their stories forward through time, creating bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors where all power ultimately flows. In the ruins of Harappa, along what was once the Indus River, archaeologists walk through streets that were laid out with mathematical precision over 4,000 years ago. The main boulevards run perfectly straight for miles, intersecting at right angles to create a grid pattern that would look familiar to any modern city planner. But this was not the haphazard growth of a settlement that gradually became urban. This was deliberate design, executed on a massive scale by engineers who thought in terms of centuries rather than decades. Every major street in Harappan cities was exactly 33 feet wide. Every minor street was exactly 16.5 feet wide. The standardization was so precise that archaeologists can predict the width of newly excavated streets before they finish clearing them. This level of consistency across dozens of cities spanning hundreds of thousands of square miles suggests a degree of central planning and administrative coordination that rivals modern nation-states. But the most remarkable aspect of Harappan urban planning was not visible from street level. Beneath the carefully laid pavements ran a sophisticated drainage system that handled both sewage and storm water with engineering skill that would not be matched again for thousands of years. Main drains were large enough for maintenance workers to walk through, lined with precisely fitted bricks and covered with stone slabs that could be removed for cleaning and repair. Every house in major Harappan cities had its own private bathroom with a toilet connected to the municipal sewer system. Wastewater flowed through covered drains that ran beneath the streets, eventually reaching settling tanks and treatment facilities outside the city walls. The system was designed to handle the waste of populations that may have reached 100,000 people, making it one of the earliest examples of public health infrastructure anywhere in the world. The sophistication of Harappan plumbing extended to their water supply systems as well. Public wells were positioned throughout each city, spaced at regular intervals to ensure that no household was more than a few hundred feet from fresh water. The wells were built to standardized specifications, with brick-lined shafts that extended deep into the water table. Many included settling chambers that allowed sediment to precipitate out before water was drawn for drinking and cooking. Private homes in Harappan cities often included their own wells in interior courtyards, along with bathing platforms that drained into the municipal sewer system. The combination of private and public water sources created redundancy that protected communities against drought or contamination of individual wells. It was urban planning that prioritized public health and quality of life in ways that seem remarkably modern. The layout of Harappan cities reveals careful attention to zoning and land use that separated different activities while maintaining easy access between residential and commercial areas. Craft workshops were concentrated in specific districts, with metalworking, pottery making, and bead manufacturing each assigned to particular neighborhoods. This separation prevented industrial pollution from affecting residential areas, while creating economies of scale that allowed craftsmen to share tools, techniques, and raw materials. Residential districts were planned with attention to privacy and comfort that shows deep understanding of human social needs. Houses were built around central courtyards that provided light and ventilation, while maintaining separation from the noise and activity of public streets. Room layouts followed consistent patterns that maximized cross-ventilation during hot seasons while providing enclosed spaces for family activities during cooler months. But Harappan urban planning was not just about practical efficiency. The cities were designed with aesthetic considerations that created environments of remarkable beauty and tranquility. Wide boulevards were lined with trees and gardens. Public spaces included platforms and amphitheaters where communities could gather for markets, festivals, and civic activities. The overall effect was urban environments that balanced density with openness, functionality with beauty. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, a different approach to urban planning was creating cities that celebrated hierarchy, power, and religious devotion. Babylonian and Assyrian cities were organized around massive temple complexes called ziggurats that served as focal points for both spiritual and administrative activities. These artificial mountains rose in stepped terraces toward the sky, their summits crowned with shrines dedicated to patron deities who were believed to watch over and protect the urban population. The ziggurat at Babylon, known to later cultures as the Tower of Babel, was the largest structure in the ancient world. Its base covered nearly 4 acres, and its height may have reached over 300 feet. Climbing to the summit required ascending a series of ramps and staircases that wound around the exterior of the structure, a journey that took visitors through multiple levels representing different aspects of divine authority and cosmic order. Mesopotamian cities were planned to emphasize the relationship between earthly and divine power. Processional streets led from city gates to temple complexes designed to accommodate religious festivals where statues of gods were carried through the streets on elaborately decorated platforms. These ceremonial routes were lined with walls decorated with glazed brick reliefs showing dragons, lions, and other symbols of divine protection. The famous Ishtar Gate of Babylon exemplifies this integration of urban planning with religious symbolism. The gate itself was a masterpiece of architectural engineering, with multiple chambers and defensive features that controlled access to the inner city. But it was also a work of art, covered with brilliant blue glazed bricks and decorated with golden dragons and bulls that seemed to move in the flickering light of oil lamps and torches. Beyond the gate, the processional way led directly to the ziggurat complex, creating a straight line that connected the outer world with the sacred center of the city. This boulevard was wide enough to accommodate large crowds and was paved with limestone slabs that created a smooth surface for wheeled vehicles and ceremonial processions. The planning created urban theater on a monumental scale, transforming religious festivals into civic spectacles that reinforced social bonds and political authority. Roman urban planning represented perhaps the most systematic approach to city design in the ancient world. Roman engineers developed standardized methods for laying out new cities that could be applied anywhere in the empire, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. These methods ensured that Roman cities would be immediately familiar to travelers and administrators, creating a sense of cultural unity across vast distances and diverse populations. The typical Roman city plan started with 2 main streets that crossed at right angles in the center of the settlement. The north-south street was called the Cardo, while the east-west street was called the Decumanus. Additional streets ran parallel to these main axes, creating a grid pattern that divided the city into rectangular blocks called insulae. This system was so standardized that Roman surveyors could lay out a new city in a matter of days. At the intersection of the Cardo and Decumanus, Romans placed the Forum, a large public square surrounded by important civic buildings. The Forum served as the commercial, political, and social heart of the city, where citizens gathered to conduct business, participate in political assemblies, and socialize with friends and neighbors. The standardized placement of forums meant that visitors to any Roman city could immediately orient themselves and find the center of urban activity. Roman planning also included sophisticated infrastructure that supported urban populations far larger than any previous civilization had managed to sustain. Aqueducts brought fresh water from mountain springs and rivers, sometimes across distances of over 50 miles. The water was distributed throughout the city through a network of pipes and channels that supplied public fountains, private homes, and commercial establishments. Roman sewer systems were equally impressive, with main drains large enough to navigate by boat and complex networks of smaller pipes that carried wastewater away from residential areas. The famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome was large enough to serve a population of over 1 million people, making it one of the largest urban infrastructure projects ever undertaken in the ancient world. But Roman urban planning was not just about engineering efficiency. It was also about creating environments that reflected Roman values and cultural identity. Public buildings were designed to impress visitors with the power and sophistication of Roman civilization. Theaters, amphitheaters, temples, and basilicas were built to standardized designs that created instantly recognizable urban landscapes throughout the empire. Roman residential planning also reflected social hierarchies and cultural priorities. Wealthy citizens lived in spacious villas with private gardens, elaborate decoration, and sophisticated amenities like central heating and private baths. Working-class citizens lived in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae that maximized density while providing basic shelter and sanitation. The spatial organization of Roman cities made social distinctions visible in the urban landscape itself. The planning of Roman cities also included careful attention to defense and security. City walls were built to standardized specifications that could withstand siege warfare. Gates were positioned to control access and channel traffic through defensive checkpoints. Streets were laid out to facilitate the movement of military units while preventing enemy forces from advancing rapidly through the urban core. Perhaps most remarkably, Roman urban planning was designed to accommodate growth and change over centuries. The grid system could be extended indefinitely as populations grew. Infrastructure systems were built with excess capacity that allowed cities to expand without major reconstruction. Public buildings were designed to be renovated and enlarged as needs changed. This long-term perspective allowed Roman cities to remain viable and prosperous for hundreds of years. The contrast between different approaches to ancient urban planning reveals the diverse ways that human societies have organized themselves in cities. Harappan planning prioritized equality, public health, and environmental harmony. Mesopotamian planning emphasized religious devotion and political hierarchy. Roman planning focused on administrative efficiency and cultural unity. Each approach reflected different values and priorities, but all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in creating livable urban environments. Ancient city planners understood something that modern urban designers are still learning: that cities are not just collections of buildings, but complex systems that shape human behavior, social relationships, and cultural identity. The spatial organization of urban environments influences how people interact, how resources are distributed, and how power is exercised. By studying ancient approaches to urban planning, we can better understand the full range of possibilities for organizing human settlements. The durability of many ancient cities testifies to the wisdom of their planners. Harappan cities were continuously occupied for over 1,000 years. Roman cities provided the foundation for medieval and modern settlements throughout Europe. The principles developed by ancient urban planners continue to influence city design today, demonstrating that good planning can create environments that serve human needs across centuries and millennia. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine walking through these ancient cities at the height of their prosperity. Picture the broad boulevards of Harappa, with their precise drainage systems hidden beneath perfectly fitted stones. Feel the shade of trees planted along residential streets where families have lived for generations in houses connected to municipal water and sewer systems. Walk the processional way of Babylon, where glazed brick dragons seem to come alive in the flickering light of ceremonial torches. Stand in the forum of a Roman city, surrounded by the architectural symbols of a civilization that spanned continents and endured for centuries. These ancient planners were architects of human possibility, creating urban environments that supported not just survival but flourishing, not just individual comfort but community life, not just present needs but future generations. Their legacy lives on in every well-planned city, every public space designed for human interaction, every infrastructure system that serves the common good. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the day's urgencies fade and consciousness begins its gentle drift toward rest, we find ourselves connected to something vast and ancient. The same stars that guided Polynesian navigators across trackless oceans shine down on us tonight. The same curiosity that drove Babylonian astronomers to map celestial cycles still moves us to wonder about our place in the cosmos. The same hands that shaped clay in Harappan workshops, that carved obsidian into surgical blades, that twisted gold into Celtic torques, live on in our own capacity to create, to heal, to make beauty from raw materials. The ancient minds we have journeyed with tonight were not primitive ancestors stumbling toward enlightenment. They were us, complete and whole, working with the same intelligence, the same creativity, the same deep longing to understand and transform the world around them. They solved problems we are still working on. They created beauty that still moves us. They developed technologies that in some cases exceeded our own capabilities. They were not the beginning of human achievement, but the full expression of it, as bright and complex as anything we have accomplished since. When we look at the ruins of their cities, we see not the faded remnants of lost civilizations, but the enduring foundations of human possibility. Every modern city traces its lineage back to those first urban planners who figured out how to bring thousands of people together in harmony. Every drainage system echoes the innovations of Harappan engineers who understood that public health requires community cooperation. Every democratic institution builds on experiments in governance that began in ancient assemblies where ordinary citizens first learned to govern themselves. The Oracle of Delphi may be silent now, but the human search for meaning beyond the ordinary world continues in every meditation, every prayer, every moment when we open ourselves to wisdom that seems to come from beyond individual consciousness. The Antikythera mechanism may lie broken in a museum case, but its legacy lives on in every computer, every calculation, every attempt to model the complex systems that govern our universe. The trade routes that connected ancient civilizations may have shifted and changed, but the human drive to exchange goods, ideas, and stories across vast distances continues in every email, every international flight, every cultural fusion that creates something new from the meeting of different traditions. The Sogdian merchants who learned to speak a dozen languages and navigate a dozen different cultures were the ancestors of every person who has ever felt at home in the world, who has ever found common ground with strangers from distant places. The Scythian warriors who marked their bodies with spiritual maps, the Celtic kings who married themselves to the land, the Maya astronomers who calculated time in cycles lasting millions of years, all understood something that we are still learning. Human consciousness is not separate from the natural world, but part of it, shaped by the same forces that move planets and tides, governed by the same patterns that spiral through galaxies and seashells alike. Their monuments still speak to us across the centuries. Stonehenge continues to frame the rising sun on the summer solstice, just as it did when the first ceremonies were held in its shadow. The pyramids of Giza still point toward true north with mathematical precision that amazes modern surveyors. The stepped temples of Maya cities still align with Venus cycles that continue to mark time with clockwork regularity. But perhaps their greatest monument was not built of stone or metal, but of something more enduring. It was the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who observed, experimented, and passed on their discoveries to the children who would carry human knowledge forward into an uncertain future. This invisible monument, built of curiosity and courage, of careful attention and bold imagination, is their true legacy. It lives not in museums, but in every moment when we choose to learn rather than assume, to create rather than consume, to connect rather than isolate ourselves. The ancient world was not a simpler place. It was, if anything, more complex than our own, requiring its inhabitants to master skills we have forgotten, to maintain relationships we no longer understand, to navigate social and spiritual realities that extended far beyond individual concerns. They were simultaneously more connected to the natural world and more aware of their cosmic context than most people today. They lived in communities where everyone knew their role and their responsibilities to the larger whole. Yet they were also individuals with hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments, moments of joy and periods of suffering that would be completely familiar to us. The letters found in ancient archives reveal people worrying about their children, missing absent friends, struggling with difficult decisions, celebrating small victories. Across 5,000 years of history, human nature remains recognizably constant. The contexts change, but the fundamental experiences of consciousness, relationship, and meaning-making continue unchanged. This continuity suggests something profound about the nature of human existence. We are not isolated in time, cut off from our past by the accident of when we happened to be born. We are part of an ongoing conversation that began when the first humans looked up at the stars and wondered what they were, when the first farmers planted seeds and trusted that the future would reward present effort, when the first storytellers gathered audiences around fires and began the long work of making sense of existence through narrative. Every ancient innovation that improved human life continues to benefit us today. Every work of ancient art that captured beauty or meaning continues to enrich our experience. Every ancient insight into the nature of consciousness, community, or cosmos continues to guide us as we navigate our own challenges and opportunities. We are the heirs to the greatest fortune ever accumulated, the collected wisdom and creativity of every human generation that has ever lived. The boundaries between past and present dissolve when we realize that the same fundamental forces that shaped ancient civilizations continue to shape our own. The same cycles of growth and decay, creation and destruction, integration and differentiation that governed their history govern ours as well. The same opportunities for wisdom and folly, for cooperation and conflict, for transcendence and limitation that faced them face us too. But we also inherit their solutions, their innovations, their hard-won understanding of how to live well in an uncertain world. We inherit their maps of consciousness, their technologies of meaning-making, their examples of how individual excellence can serve collective flourishing. We inherit their demonstration that human creativity is limitless, that curiosity can overcome any obstacle, that beauty and meaning can be found or created in any circumstances. As sleep carries you gently into the realm of dreams, where time moves differently and impossible things become natural, remember that you carry within yourself the legacy of every ancient mind that ever wondered, ever questioned, ever reached beyond the limitations of its immediate circumstances to touch something eternal. You are the descendant of astronomers and navigators, of engineers and artists, of healers and visionaries who proved that human consciousness is capable of miracles. Their blood flows in your veins, their curiosity burns in your mind, their creativity moves in your hands, their dreams live on in your imagination. You are not separate from the ancient world, but its culmination, its continuation, its living expression in the present moment. The same intelligence that built the first cities, that mapped the first constellations, that sailed the first oceans, thinks your thoughts and sees through your eyes. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of something magnificent and eternal, a story that began with the first awakening of human consciousness and continues in every moment when wonder triumphs over indifference, when love overcomes fear, when the human spirit reaches once again toward the infinite mystery that calls to us from every star, every flower, every moment of genuine connection between one consciousness and another. Tonight, as you settle into rest, imagine the vast web of connections that link you to every ancient civilization we have visited together. The bronze gears of the Antikythera mechanism still turn in the mathematical formulas we use to navigate space. The Polynesian understanding of wave patterns echoes in our modern appreciation for how information flows through complex systems. The Harappan insight that cities must serve human health and happiness guides every urban planner who designs with people rather than just profit in mind. The ancient world was not a museum of curiosities, but a living laboratory where human beings first figured out how to be human on a civilized scale. They were the original researchers into questions we are still investigating. How do we balance individual freedom with collective responsibility? How do we create meaning in the face of mortality? How do we organize societies that allow human potential to flourish? How do we maintain connection with the natural world while building technological capabilities? How do we govern ourselves wisely? How do we find the sacred in the midst of the ordinary? Their answers were not perfect, but they were genuine attempts by sincere minds to solve real problems. Their successes provide models we can still learn from. Their failures offer warnings we would be wise to heed. Their overall trajectory shows human consciousness gradually expanding its capacity for complexity, compassion, and creativity, learning through countless experiments in living how to build communities that honor both individual dignity and collective flourishing. The astronomical knowledge that allowed Maya priests to predict eclipses with extraordinary precision lives on in every weather forecast, every GPS calculation, every prediction of planetary motion that guides space exploration. The medical understanding that enabled ancient surgeons to perform successful operations using obsidian scalpels continues in every modern surgery where precision instruments save lives and restore health. The engineering wisdom that allowed Roman architects to build domes that have stood for 2,000 years influences every architect who designs for permanence rather than planned obsolescence. But perhaps most importantly, the spiritual insights that helped ancient peoples find meaning and purpose in their lives remain available to us today. The Zoroastrian understanding that life and death are part of a larger cycle of transformation speaks to anyone who has found peace in accepting the natural rhythms of existence. The Celtic recognition that human consciousness is married to the living earth resonates with everyone who finds healing in nature. The Greek mysteries that revealed the immortal nature of awareness echo in every meditative tradition that helps people discover their deeper identity beyond the surface turbulence of daily life. The ancient world was not a place of primitive simplicity, but of sophisticated complexity that addressed the full range of human needs and potentials. Ancient peoples understood that human beings require not just food and shelter, but beauty, meaning, community, and connection to something larger than individual existence. They built civilizations that attended to physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions of human experience, with an integration that we are still trying to achieve. Their monuments were not just displays of power, but attempts to create structures that could hold and transmit wisdom across generations. Every stone circle that frames the rising sun, every pyramid that points toward the pole star, every temple that focuses attention on the sacred represents an effort to build permanence into human experience, to create stability in the midst of constant change, to anchor consciousness in truths that transcend the temporary circumstances of any particular moment. The trade networks that connected ancient civilizations were not just commercial enterprises, but cultural exchange systems that allowed the best insights and innovations of each society to spread and enrich all the others. Silk Road merchants carried more than silk. They carried stories, techniques, philosophical insights, artistic styles, mathematical concepts, and spiritual practices that cross-pollinated human culture on a global scale. They were the original globalists, proving that human diversity is most beautiful when it flows together rather than remaining isolated in separate streams. The navigation techniques that allowed Polynesian voyagers to cross vast oceans without instruments demonstrate capacities of human awareness that we have largely forgotten, but that remain latent within us. Their ability to read wave patterns, to sense direction through their bodies, to maintain course through intuitive connection with natural forces, represents a way of knowing that complements and enriches our technological approaches to finding our way in the world. Ancient legal systems that balanced individual rights with community needs offer models for contemporary efforts to create justice that serves both personal freedom and social harmony. The Athenian practice of ostracism, the Egyptian protection of women's property rights, the Celtic emphasis on honor-based compensation, the Roman development of written law accessible to all citizens, all represent experiments in governance that contributed insights we still use today. The sacred rituals that connected ancient peoples to divine forces were not superstitious practices, but sophisticated technologies of consciousness that helped individuals and communities maintain psychological and spiritual health. Whether through oracle vapors that induced visionary states, through ancestor ceremonies that maintained connection with cultural wisdom, through seasonal festivals that synchronized human activity with natural cycles, ancient spiritual practices provided meaning, guidance, and healing that many people today seek through therapy, meditation, and other contemporary approaches to well-being. The craft traditions that produced ancient art and artifacts represent ways of working with materials that honored both function and beauty, that created objects designed to last for generations rather than to be quickly discarded. Ancient artisans understood that the process of creation is as important as the final product, that working with focused attention and genuine care creates objects that carry positive energy into the world. Their workshops were schools of mindfulness, places where ordinary materials were transformed through skilled attention into extraordinary expressions of human creativity. The urban planning principles that made ancient cities livable for large populations demonstrate understanding of human social needs that goes far beyond simple efficiency. Harappan cities that provided every household with clean water and waste disposal, Roman cities that included public spaces for community gathering, Mesopotamian cities that integrated religious and civic functions, all show recognition that cities must serve not just economic functions but the full range of human needs for health, beauty, meaning, and social connection. As you rest now in the quiet comfort of your own time and place, remember that you are the living culmination of all these ancient experiments in human possibility. Every breath you take is connected to the same atmosphere that carried the prayers of ancient priests toward the stars. Every heartbeat echoes the same rhythm that pulsed through the bodies of Polynesian navigators reading ocean swells in the darkness. Every thought you think participates in the same consciousness that imagined the first cities, calculated the first eclipses, created the first works of art that made ordinary materials luminous with meaning. The ancient minds live on in you. Their greatest creation was not any monument or artifact, but the very capacity for transcendence that allows human beings to transform limitation into possibility, to find meaning in suffering, to create beauty from chaos. This is their true gift to the future, their imperishable legacy, their promise that no matter how dark the night may seem, human consciousness will always find a way to kindle new light in the darkness. You are that light, burning bright in your own time, carrying forward the eternal flame of human curiosity, creativity, and hope into whatever wonders the future may hold.